Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Protecting ePHI and Privacy in an Internet of Medical Things World. My name is Shayla Hankey, Director of Marketing at Great Bay Software, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to submit your questions via the questions module within the GoToWebinar tool, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. In addition, at the end of the presentation, we'll also select the lucky winner of the Canary All-in-One Home Security System. And lastly, we'll also send a copy of the recording after the webinar. Today's presentation will be given by Lee Kim, the Director of Privacy and Security at HIMSS North America, and a Fellow of HIMSS, where she serves as an analyst, information privacy, and cybersecurity professional and liaison. She is an AV-rated attorney in healthcare and intellectual property law with over 10 years of legal experience. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you. Glad to be here. So today I wanted to speak to everyone about the Internet of Medical Things and security around that. Just in terms of background, I just wanted to give a general definition just to essentially paint the landscape, set the universe in terms of what we are speaking of in terms of Internet of Medical Things. And so a general definition how Internet of Medical Things could be understood is, well, we've all heard about Internet of Things. These are essentially anything that is any kind of device, as in an electromechanical device that has some kind of network connectivity, and of course, being a Internet of Things kind of thing, of course, it's technology enabled. So there's a little computer inside that's often, placed inside of that connected device that controls the operations and configuration and everything else, so that the IoT device can hopefully do well with its intended function. Now, the Internet of Medical Things is a subset of IoT, and just simply IoMT is anything medical that fits within the IoT realm. So, it could be something such as a connected infusion pump, which many hospitals have thousands of, either in stock and or being deployed in patient rooms to deliver to them the life-sustaining doses of insulin, especially for type 1 diabetics. So it's very typical, I would say, for a lot of our U.S. hospitals and actually hospitals around the world to have these IoMT devices. And I wanted to say one additional thing as well. In terms of my second bullet point, what does IoMT include? So here we're talking about the form factor of IoMT. It can be a standalone device that's somehow connected to your network, usually wirelessly, such as that wireless infusion pump that I'd spoken of. But IoMT can include other things. Again, the physical form factor of it can certainly change depending upon how that computerized technology is deployed and implemented in the product design. So it can include the realm of, in addition to the standalone devices, it can include wearables, things that you may wear externally. It may also include ingestibles, particularly in the world of MEMS, microelectro machines. We have these tiny sensors that can actually be ingested by humans, and so that for diagnostic purposes, for example, one can understand what may be happening in terms of either the digestion of the individual, what that person's anatomy may look like, etc. Things used for diagnostic purposes oftentimes tiny little sensors that we may ingest that can provide valuable information and intelligence in terms of what is happening with that individual patient. Very interesting, by the way. We can have smart devices, of course. We may have implantable devices such as pacemakers and other things, which actually many of them do nowadays have internet connectivity. We can also have tethered devices. So in other words, it can be an accessory of sorts that may be connected to your smartphone, for example, that can function as a medical device. It may even include a smartphone application that actually functions as some kind of medical device, where it's essentially software as a device. So that can be part of the universe of IoMT. So we have all this convenience in terms of IoMT, treating the patient, diagnosing what the patient's condition may be, maybe even getting some intelligence as to what the prognosis as to that patient's condition may be. But we certainly are in a world where we're speaking about technology. Nothing is certainly foolproof. So, realistically, need to talk about the risks, right? And in terms of risks, and also most importantly in terms of Data Privacy Day, I wanted to mention really important things such as, you look at these devices, which are essentially some kind of computerized devices that are constantly collecting data. Okay, what kind of data is being collected? Not only, what kind of data is being collected from that device, but does it contain personally identifying information? Is that ePHI? Is that PII? Can that data be used to identify the individual just natively? Or can the data perhaps be somehow traced back, brought back to the point where even if it's supposedly anonymous, can I actually combine that with data from other reliable information sources and essentially bring back, rebuild that data to re-identify you? So that's one example of an IoMT risk. Another risk, of course, is, this can be potentially very sensitive, private, significant information. Who owns that data? How's that data processed? Is there a copy of that data that is pulled and downloaded to a server? Does the manufacturer, company, or some kind of third party have access to that data? Or is it me and or my hospital alone? This all depends, especially in the day and age where a lot of IoMT is essentially connected with the cloud, right? There's no concept of local storage. Instead, it's quote unquote in the cloud and oftentimes managed by third-party vendors, perhaps ones which may subcontract with a third-party cloud service to host that data and to manage that data in some way. I also mentioned, the question of aggregation of that data. One piece of data or one stream of data may be somewhat meaningful, but if it gets accumulated, if it gets aggregated with others, what kind of picture can we build? And again, there's always that risk of re-identification should that data set be able to be re-identified in some way. Last but not least, we're always concerned about data leaks and even full-blown data breaches. One of the significant concerns, top of mind concerns that we all have is in terms of IoMT and data, what if there's some kind of breach? Whenever there's a breach, that leads to potential downtime, that leads to all kinds of consequences that disrupts the daily business and potentially clinical operations of your organization, especially if that IoMT device is deployed in a clinical environment. Believe me, people's workflows will be disrupted. One may need to gauge whether they can actually turn off that device, if there's some kind of alternate device which may be used, if there was some kind of breach, or if that device was infected by malware. Because another risk that can happen is that because that IoMT is essentially a computerized yet connected device, should that one device be infected with some kind of malware, such as ransomware, or should that device be infected with something that essentially causes a denial of service, you don't want these kinds of threats, these kinds of incidents rather, to spread to the rest of your network. So, for example, if there's certain malware that gets infected on one device, and this is not unusual in hospital settings, if the network is poorly segmented, or maybe not segmented at all if you have flat network, that malware, if it has the ability to self-propagate, for example, as in a ransom worm or other kind of worm, it may have the ability to propagate to other endpoints in your network, absent any kind of physical or virtual segmenting of your network, absent those types of controls. Next slide, please. So, once again, I wanted to sort of refocus what we're thinking of when we talk about risks to IoMT. Literally the question of the what if. And unfortunately, I think in today's world, we're perhaps predisposed to this kind of thinking, but you always have to be realistic and think, look, this is a computerized device. No technology ever works perfectly 100% of the time. What if something goes wrong? What if the device fails? What if there's a technical failure? What if there's a misconfiguration? What if there's malware? Or what if there's a cyber attack on that device? None of us that are in the healthcare sector want to see, especially a patient, die or be seriously injured as a result of an attack or compromise or malfunction on an IoMT device. But patient safety is certainly something that now we are more acutely aware of than ever in terms of the risks for IoMT. So I would like to think that when we are all doing our risk assessments as to our IoMT devices, that we think about the impact on the patient in addition to the impact on our business operations, on our clinical operations, things of that nature, should a device fail or it be compromised, or if there's some kind of human error that may end up with that kind of misconfiguration. So I also mentioned just briefly, how this occurs, but it's safe to say, look, if we're certainly being too myopic if we think about just simply cyber attacks or ransomware. There's all kinds of ransomware. There are all kinds of ways to attack a device by cyber means. There's certainly ways to sabotage or damage devices through various means, not just technical. It could be even insider threat. Now, we never want that to happen, but that's actually a reality. The risk of physical access to the device and whether the device is being configured correctly, whether it's being operated correctly. And like I said, there's a little computer inside all these devices that essentially make these devices go. The little embedded program and/or some kind of electromechanical part or some kind of function in that device may fail as well. So we need to keep all these risks in mind, because it's really important, especially when so many of these IoMT devices within U.S. hospital systems and worldwide are either life-sustaining or life-saving, for that matter. It's very critical, especially in view of the patient. Not to mention, of course, the costs to the organization, the downtime, the business effects, the clinical effects, the goodwill effects as well, should something potentially catastrophic happen. Next slide, please. So, we want to focus at this point in terms of mitigation of the risks. Here is essentially not an exhaustive list, but it's essentially a general consensus around what the recommendations are by vendors and others in this field in terms of how to mitigate risks with IoMT. Network segmentation is key. Those of you in IT security, or those of you that are familiar with the field, know that first and foremost, you don't want your network on a flat network where once you get access to one machine or device, you get access to everything. That is certainly not a best practice for all of the obvious reasons. So as an example, let's say, for example, that we have a hacker that's trying to hack into your network. If you have a flat network at your hospital organization, for example, the hacker gets into one, let's say the hacker gets into a IoMT device that's one of your endpoints. If that network is not segmented, then he or she can discover what other nodes there are on that network. He or she can essentially hop from one machine to another, essentially pivot through the network without too much difficulty, without having to find that proxy that that can be used to essentially route into your network through various intricate means. Instead of having to find that specific proxy that can pivot from one closed network to another, he or she just simply has access to everything. So that's one example of why it's really important to segment off networks. And of course, many hospital organizations have public or guest networks, and you never know what is being connected to that wireless network. So it's always a good idea, at the very minimum, but hopefully more, to have segmentation between your enterprise networks and your public guest networks, such as virtual LANs or other means, or even physical LANs. And so, that's certainly one very rudimentary but important best practice to deploy. This is certainly a must. Hopefully the device, the IoMT, which you do have, gives you the capability to change the password. Hopefully it's not just one password or something that is hard-coded in a vendor default. Then virtually anyone who has access to the manual for the IoMT can get access to it, and that's something you don't want. So that's why it's really important to use strong, complex passwords that are long passwords that are combinations of uppercase, lowercase letters, something that is not guessable, something ideally with symbols, something that is difficult for a hacker to crack into, so to speak, with a word list. Something that hopefully will not be on one of those word lists with popular passwords such as "let me in" or 1 2 3 4 5 6. Something that is not crackable. Some other things in terms of risk mitigation and best practices with IoMT. Now, we all know that many IoMT vendors feel the pressure in terms of having to have better security, having a better ear to researchers and others that report security bugs and or vulnerabilities that are discovered or suspected. So as a result, many vendors are getting much better in terms of issuing patches. But depending upon the delicate nature in which the IoMT device is deployed, It could be, for example, in an implantable pacemaker. I mean, how do you update that device were it not for actual physical access to that device? In the case of a pacemaker, many of those implanted devices, the technology involves actually literally needing to crack open a patient's chest to get that device out. And, you really have to question, is the patient's life, going to be at risk? What kind of harm is there to the patient? What's the impact on the patient? What is the impact to our clinical environment before we deploy this patch? In other words, we shouldn't just blindly do so. Another example as well is many of us have heard about the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. Many vendors have issued patches. The initial reports from those, from the field and from certain vendors are that there are certainly performance impacts and slowdowns. And so that's why it's really important to carefully test and evaluate patches before just simply deploying them, because otherwise your clinical environment may be either, I wouldn't say at a standstill, but it may be very much crippled because some kind of patch or fix really weighs in on the operational inefficiency of that IoMT device. There are frequently servers that are deployed in connection with these IoMT devices that host software for operating and configuring such devices. So as to those servers and systems that interact with the IoMT device, be sure to regularly upgrade operating systems, antivirus systems, and other controls on your network, even your security solutions, right? There's certainly, because there's certainly security solutions that are, that for example, may have been discontinued, and maybe there are some severe security vulnerabilities in them, and it may be possible for a hacker to essentially deploy an exploit and get administrative or even system level privileges to, essentially that system, and perhaps own your network, so to speak. You really don't want that. So that's why it's really important to, just generally be sure to harden your operating systems, harden your network, practice defense in depth. Know what's normal and what's not normal for your network. I can't emphasize this enough. You need to know what kind of IP addresses are normal in terms of what's connecting to my network, and what ports should be open, what ports should be listening, what kind of volume of traffic is normal, what's abnormal. Some of the reasons for this is because, let's just name one example. A typical command used to, a typical poor man's command, I should say, that could be used to look at network traffic and connectivity and all that on Unix-based systems and Windows is netset. If hypothetically you were to execute that command and maybe issue some kind of watch command to see what's happening in terms of what ports are open, listening, what IP addresses are connecting into my systems, what IP addresses are connecting out of my systems, unless you know definitively that, who's connecting and who's not connecting to your network, you might not be able to see truly what's suspicious and what's not. In other words, you may not be able to differentiate the signal from the noise. And that can be very problematic, because if you are solely relying on your vendor solutions, you may not be able to understand what a false positive may be. And as we all know in the security world, sometimes there can be a lot of false positives to the point where we all have alert fatigue. So that's something to perhaps invest in and to be cognizant of, to essentially have some kind of intelligent device or system to help you create that baseline, to know what's good, what's not good, what's strange, what's potentially aberrational, and not just in terms of cyber attacks, even in terms of insider threat activity, right? Who may be egressing lots and lots of patient information or even valuable intellectual property of the organization out the door. So, you know, intelligence systems such as those can go a long way and can help boost the security profile of, you know, essentially of your, you know, your security solutions and essentially of your security program. So that's certainly a good thing to, you know, take a closer look at and to get that intelligence, to get that insight. Next slide, please. So let me say a few words about compliance, perhaps above and beyond what you might see here. Compliance is a really important thing. You know, let me mention, of course, what we all know and love about HIPAA. That, of course, HIPAA is certainly relevant and implicated if you use IoMT in your organization. It is a, you know, IoMT is essentially an information system much like everything else. And so, yes, you likely do need to include IoMT in your risk assessments. You need to manage those risks. You need to have a contingency plan in case there's some kind of failure, such as the ones I outlined, whether physical, technical, you know, human error, whatever it is. You do need to train folks in terms of security awareness vis-a-vis IoMT and other things so that you as end users or operators of those devices can, you know, render good judgment and make good decisions in terms of the use of these devices and tools that are to help make our lives easier, provide better patient care, hopefully help the patient's health baseline and their prognosis, and, you know, all the good things that these devices are designed and intended to do. So, as a foundational element, HIPAA is certainly quite relevant. Don't forget your policies and procedures as well, as they relate to IoMT and what may be brought into the organization and what might not be. Your acceptable use policies to that end in terms of what is allowed in the organization and what's not, and what is allowed to connect to your network and what's not. Keep in mind too, though, that the vast majority of us have local, state, and or other federal laws and regulations to be cognizant of. General boilerplate stuff, of course, depending upon your jurisdiction, there may be a different privacy law that may be applicable to your situation, depending upon your jurisdiction and or that of affected patients. So let me give you an example. I mentioned that one of the risks of IoMT, of course, is you have all this data, and of course, data breach is a potential risk, it's a potential negative unwanted event. But if that happens, most of the jurisdictions in the United States, for example, do have breach laws that are specific to the jurisdiction. So, for example, if patients from, let me just give you an example, if patients from Nebraska, Kentucky, Iowa are affected, you may need to work with your counsel in terms of breach notification laws from those states to see whether and to what extent the breach needs to be reported, and most importantly, to whom the breach needs to be reported to, what it needs to say at minimum. Of course, you could always go above and beyond what the law or applicable regulation may state, but that's certainly something to always keep in mind. For those of you that may be curious about what kind of privacy laws are out there, a wonderful resource is by the National Conference of State Legislators, NCSL. So I encourage you to go to that website should you want to look up the privacy laws that may be, in several states or in one or more jurisdictions nationally. In addition, there's also the European Union GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which essentially subsumed the European Data Protection Directive. And so, there may be instances in which the GDPR may apply, keeping in mind that on May 25th, for any entities that are required to comply with that, the enforcement deadline, I should say, is May 25th of 2018. Let me caveat that, though, in saying that we don't know how, from an enforcement perspective, how much and how severe the penalties may be for lack of compliance. And certainly, though, in today's healthcare environment, especially for hospital organizations that may have international presence, these international laws are certainly relevant. And just as well, the analysis may vary if, for example, you may have, employees for the European Union. Perhaps your compliance requirements may be different in that case. And let me also highlight, finally, our HIMSS Privacy and Security Toolkits. If you were to click on the link that is displayed there on the screen for toolkits, we have almost 1,000 articles on all things privacy and security. These cover cloud computing, mobile security, risk assessments, compliance, such as some of the issues we've outlined here, and many other things. We have policies and procedures. We have templates for business associate agreements. We have many resources in relation to data privacy as well. So, you definitely should take a look at our toolkits if you haven't already, to see if there are some resources that may be helpful to you and or your organization. Plus, HIMSS has been an active participant and supporter of Data Privacy Day for the past 5 years. So if you were to go to www.himss.org/DPD, you will be able to see our Data Privacy Day resources there as well. So, next slide, please. That is the actual end of my presentation. And Shayla, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lee. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Before we jump into the live Q&A, we're going to go ahead and draw the prize, which, as you can see here, we're going to be giving away a Canary indoor wireless full HD all-in-one home security system to a lucky winner, and that winner is Manny Amador from Memorial Healthcare. So congratulations, Manny. We'll reach out to you after the webinar and coordinate the shipment of your prize. Congratulations. And so now moving into the questions, Lee, we've got a couple here. Let's see here. Can you share some best practices regarding the best way to secure wireless networks and also securing endpoints?
Yes, absolutely. So, certainly, I think that this is pretty much common sense, but I just wanted to say that in terms of wireless networks, we all know that wireless networks are inherently less secure than a wired network because of the fact that, the signals are literally carried over the air, so anyone within distance of receiving that signal may be able to eavesdrop or somehow tap into that connection. At least that's the theory. Now, in terms of best practices, in terms of securing wireless, of course, WPA2 is the authentication protocol to use in terms of that handshake protocol whenever you're authenticating to establish that wireless connection. That's number one. But number two, the thing that I wanted to highlight as well is, we can secure the channel that way, and we can, especially with wireless networks, we can segment them as appropriate to the kinds of devices that are on our network. Perhaps for more mission critical devices, sometimes these are segmented or isolated on their own network for safety and security reasons. But let me emphasize this other thing too. We can secure these channels as much as we want. So in other words, picture, for example, a tunnel. We can enforce that. We can, try to make it as secure as possible. But the reality is that, if it is the case where we are still operating on insecure protocols, if we're using old versions of, SSL, which is prone to things like heartbleed and other kinds of attacks. In our HIMSS cyber threat reports, there are attacks called Freak and Logjam and other things. When we use these older implementations of SSL, keep in mind that there are severe risks such as eavesdropping, man-in-the-middle attacks, where an attacker can essentially intercept the connection in the middle and either listen in on what's happening or even tamper that traffic so that one actually sees different data or gets different data than what was intended. So if you don't mind, I just wanted to highlight that because especially since we're using so much that's tied to the cloud, and we're relying on so many web applications. So many of our web applications and secure portals and other things use these very old SSL protocols, and as a result, there's that danger. It's not as secure as you would think it is. So I kind of went a roundabout way, but those are kind of the dangers of wireless. But let's also not think about wireless in terms of the IEEE 802.11 standard, right? There's also Bluetooth and threats such as bluejacking and other things. So anything wireless, always keep in mind signals in the air, someone can grab it, someone might even want to jam it and interfere with it. So always think in terms of that wireless connection, that wireless connectivity, that wireless communication channel, do I have some kind of backup? Because, as much as we think that everything is running fine and I don't need to worry about it, I don't think any of us ever want to have all of our eggs in one basket at the same time. Anyway, sorry, a bit of a longer answer, but I just wanted to give a little bit more of a holistic picture.
No worries. That was really great. Thank you, Lee. We do have one more question here. Do you have any recommendations for deploying patches to med devices?
Yes, I would. I actually do have a few recommendations. One is whenever you have a patch that a vendor releases, it's always good to try to test it out as much as you can to see, is there a slowdown? Does it cause this device in a test mode, for example, to operate incorrectly? Test out every single situation you can think of within reason, within the time frame that you have before rolling it out. In other words, I can't emphasize this enough, but even though, a lot of people will say, oh, you need to patch this, patch this right away, don't waste time, do this. The reality is with a medical device, it really does somehow, maybe even directly affect that patient, especially if that patient is connected to it in a meaningful way. You really need to, have your test conditions set up and, almost in a, in a setting where it's, of course, non-clinical, where a patient won't be harmed. you really need to test it out and, try to gauge timing and, configurations, operations, all that stuff, just to make sure the patch didn't do something that it should not. And, I have to say as well, don't think that you're just alone in doing this. You likely have a lot of peers that are struggling with that same issue as well. Don't be afraid to reach out through, organizations such as HIMSS or even other information sharing venues where you can ask your peers through InfraGard and otherwise, hey, what's your experience with this? In fact, this is totally something that I am offering to everyone just because we're here to help you and help educate. If you're not already aware, InfraGard has a public-private partnership program called the Cyber Health Working Group. And people, do have the ability, once they are participating in that program, to ask technical questions such as patches, or even technical measures that are being done. So for anyone that has questions about getting involved with that program, please feel free to contact me after the program, and I would gladly connect you with the folks that run it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lee. I thought that your commentary today was incredibly insightful, and I'm sure our attendees do as well. So as a reminder, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sending a copy of the recording today to everyone that was able to join us, and also if you weren't able to join us. I'd like to give a big thank you to Lee Kim for joining and presenting our discussion today, as well as I'd like to thank all of our attendees. And I would continue to, I would encourage you to continue learning if you're interested in learning more about privacy, security, compliance as it relates to medical devices, protecting ePHI or PII data. Feel free to go check out all the great resources that Lee has provided to you today, as well as if you're interested in learning more about IoMT security, feel free to check out our website, which is greatbaysoftware.com, and we have a great resources section out there full of lots of great assets for you to consume. Thanks so much. Have a great day.